They told you history ended in 1991. They told you the liberal international order was an impregnable fortress guarded by the benevolent, omnipotent shield of American missile defense. But on the 30th of December 2025, that illusion didn't just crack, it evaporated. As I speak to you now, the strategic map of Europe has been rewritten, not with ink, but with hypersonic fire. The Russian Federation has officially activated the Oreshnik hypersonic missile system in Belarus. This is not a drill. This is not posturing. This is the moment the West woke up to find a gun pressed against its temple, and for the first time in 80 years, the trigger is in someone else's hand. Ambassador Boris Gryzlov confirmed it today with the cold, bureaucratic precision that should terrify every strategist in Brussels. The systems are combat ready. We are talking about a weapon that travels at Mach 10 that is 10 times the speed of sound. It strikes like a meteorite. It turns the concept of interception into a bad joke. And now, sitting just miles from the Polish border, it places every single capital in Europe, Berlin, Paris, London, Brussels, within a flight time measured in minutes, not hours. To understand the gravity of this, you have to look past the panicked headlines of the mainstream media, who are frantically trying to spin this as unprovoked aggression. You must look at the history they conveniently forget. For decades, the United States has operated under the arrogance of the Wolfowitz Doctrine, the belief that it could indefinitely expand its military infrastructure right up to Russia's doorstep without consequence. They put Aegis ashore in Poland and Romania, claiming it was for Iranian threats, a lie so transparent it was insulting. They withdrew from the ABM treaty. They withdrew from the INF treaty. They thought they could surround a nuclear superpower with a ring of steel and simply strangle it into submission. What we are witnessing now is the inevitable kinetic response to that hubris. This is a Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse, but with one terrifying difference. The technology has outpaced the diplomacy. In 1962, Kennedy and Khrushchev had hours to deliberate. Today, with Oreshnik missiles sitting in Belarus, the decision window for NATO leaders has shrunk to virtually zero. There is no time to call Washington. There is no time to convene a summit. There is only the realization that the security architecture built by the United States since the Second World War is now obsolete. The unipolar moment was predicated on a monopoly of violence. The U.S. could strike anyone, anywhere with impunity, while resting safe behind its oceans and its missile shields. That monopoly is dead. The Oreshnik represents a technological leap that renders the Patriot and THAAD systems, multi-billion-dollar investments by Western taxpayers, into expensive lawn ornaments. They cannot stop a projectile moving at 3 kilometers per second that maneuvers in flight. The physics simply do not allow it. This is the checkmate I have been warning you about. By placing these assets in Belarus, Moscow has bypassed the entire NATO buffer zone. They haven't just matched the U.S. escalation, they have checkmated it by introducing a capability that the West currently has no answer for. We are looking at a fundamental shift in the balance of terror. The Empire Bases is finding out that its bases are now nothing more than indefensible targets. The panic you are sensing from Western capitals today is real. It is the smell of fear from an establishment that realizes its bluff has finally been called. They push the bear into a corner, expecting it to cower. Instead, it just unsheathed claws that can tear through their armor like paper. The tragedy of the Western establishment is not just their arrogance, it is their profound intellectual laziness. For 30 years, they believed that the end of history meant the end of warfare between peer competitors. They convinced themselves that war was something they did to poor people in deserts, not something that could touch the manicured lawns of Brussels or the glass towers of Frankfurt. They built a military machine designed for colonial policing aircraft carriers to project power against nations with no navies, and slow subsonic cruise missiles to strike adversaries who couldn't shoot back. They spent trillions on the F-35, a flying computer meant to dominate the skies of compliant nations while completely neglecting the one area where the next great war would actually be decided, hypersonic missile technology. Now, that negligence has come due. The deployment of the Oreshnik system in Belarus is the definitive proof of a systemic failure in NATO's entire defense philosophy. We are witnessing the collapse of the missile shield myth. For years, American defense contractors sold European governments on the idea of an impenetrable umbrella. They sold them the Patriot system, the Iris-T, and the various iterations of the Aegis ashore. They promised that these systems could intercept anything the Russian Bear could throw at them. But the Oreshnik is not a Scud missile from the 1,990 seconds. It utilizes kinetic maneuvering capabilities that defy the predictive algorithms of Western interceptors. When a warhead is traveling at Mach 10 and changing its trajectory in mid-flight, the mathematical calculations required to intercept it become impossible for current NATO radar systems to solve in the seconds they have before impact. This is the circumvention of American power in its purest form. While Washington was busy weaponizing the SWIFT banking system and freezing central bank assets, believing that economic warfare alone would bring Moscow to its knees, Russian engineers were solving the physics of hypersonic flight. The West thought they could sanction Russia back to the Stone Age. They banned the export of semiconductors, microchips, and dual-use technologies, smugly predicting that the Russian military-industrial complex would run out of missiles within months. Remember those headlines from 2022? They told you Russia was stripping washing machines for chips. They told you the Kremlin's arsenal was empty. Look at the reality on the ground in Belarus today. Does the Oreshnik look like a weapon built from washing machine parts? This is the ultimate failure of the sanctions regime. Not only did the economic coercion fail to stop Russian production, but it also failed to prevent a leap in technological innovation that has left the West behind. Russia didn't just survive the economic siege, they innovated through it. They circumvented the technological blockade by developing domestic supply chains and strengthening ties with China and the global South, creating a parallel industrial ecosystem that is immune to the whims of the U.S. Treasury Department. By positioning these systems in Belarus, Moscow has effectively nullified the billions of dollars NATO spent on forward defense in Poland and the Baltics. The strategic depth that NATO thought it possessed has vanished. Belarus under President Lukashenko was dismissed by the West as a mere vassal state, a pawn to be toppled by color revolutions and NGO-funded protests. The West spent years trying to destabilize Minsk, funding opposition groups and imposing sanctions, hoping to install a compliant pro-Western regime on Russia's flank. That strategy has backfired spectacularly. Instead of a compliant buffer state, the West now faces a fortress. Belarus has integrated its defense architecture so tightly with Russia that an attack on one is existentially an attack on the other. And now, that fortress is armed with a spear that can reach across the continent. This move circumvents the geopolitical encirclement the U.S. has been building for decades. The U.S. strategy was always to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian or perhaps the last Pole, keeping the conflict far away from the American homeland and even Western Europe's core. They wanted a war of attrition on the frontier. But the Oreshnik changes the geometry of the battlefield. It turns the hinterland of Europe into the front line. It tells Berlin and Paris that they cannot hide behind Warsaw. It creates a decoupling of security interests between the U.S. and Europe that Washington fears more than anything else. The panic in Washington right now is palpable. Though they try to hide it behind stoic press briefings, they know that their primary mechanism of control, the guarantee of security, has been exposed as a fraud. If the U.S. cannot protect Berlin from a Russian hypersonic strike, then what is the point of NATO? What is the value of American hegemony if the hegemon carries a shield made of cardboard? They are realizing that their escalation dominance, the idea that the U.S. can always ramp up the pressure higher than its enemy, is gone. They cannot escalate against a power that can strike their assets faster than they can blink. They are trapped in a system of their own making, watching as the rules-based order is dismantled by the very physics of the weapons they failed to build. And this brings us to the most grotesque spectacle of all the moral posturing of the West. If the tactical failure of NATO is pathetic, its moral bankruptcy is absolute. To watch Western diplomats clutch their pearls today, screaming about the provocation of placing missiles in Belarus, is to witness the height of cynical performance art. They stand at their podiums, draped in the flags of democracy and sovereignty, and lecture the world on the dangers of escalation, hoping you have forgotten who exactly wrote the playbook on nuclear proliferation in Europe. Let us strip away the sanitized diplomatic language and look at the raw, ugly reality. The United States has treated the European continent as its own personal weapons depot for decades. For half a century, Washington has stored B-61 nuclear gravity bombs in Germany, in Italy, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, and in Turkey. They are there right now, sitting in bunkers at Bushel, at Aviano, at Kleine Brogel. Did the United States ask for Russia's permission to turn Germany into a nuclear launch pad? Did they care about the security architecture of the East when they moved nuclear-capable assets to the very borders of the Russian Federation? Of course not. In the theology of American exceptionalism, their nukes are peacekeepers, while anyone else's are instruments of terror. The deployment of the Oreshnik is not an act of aggression, it is a mirror. Russia is simply holding up a mirror to the West, and the West is terrified by the monster it sees in the reflection. This is the moral trap the empire has set for itself. By insisting that its security is absolute while Russia's security is irrelevant, it has created a situation where the only rational response for Moscow was to create a capability that could not be ignored. We must understand why Belarus accepted these weapons. The mainstream narrative tells you it is because Lukashenko is a puppet. The realist truth is that Lukashenko is a survivor. He looks at the history of nations that trusted Western assurances of protection and human rights. He looks at the graveyard of states that disarmed or failed to secure a nuclear deterrent against American intervention. Look at Libya. I remember clearly when Muammar Gaddafi was courted by the West, told that if he gave up his weapons of mass destruction program, he would be welcomed into the international community. He believed them, had disarmed. And what was his reward? A NATO humanitarian intervention that turned the most prosperous nation in Africa into an open-air slave market, a fractured hellscape ruled by warlords and terrorists. Hillary Clinton laughed on live television about his brutal murder. Do you think leaders in Minsk or Moscow or Tehran or Pyongyang forgot that laugh? That laugh was the death knell of non-proliferation. It taught the world a singular, brutal lesson. The only thing that stops the United States from turning your country into a parking lot is the ability to turn theirs into one first. Look at Iraq. The lies about WMDs were not just intelligence failures. They were a deliberate pretext to dismantle a sovereign state that refused to kneel. The United States invaded under the banner of liberation and left behind 1 million dead bodies in the vacuum that birthed ISIS. They destroyed the secular fabric of the Middle East and called it nation building. Look at Syria, where the West spent billions arming moderate rebels, a euphemism for extremists to overthrow a government, indifferent to the chaos and displacement that followed. In every single instance, the arrival of American help has been the precursor to national suicide. The leadership in Belarus saw this trajectory. They saw the color revolution attempts in 2020, the NGO-funded mobs, the sanctions, the exact same script used in Kiev in 2014. They realized that without a strategic guarantee, they were next on the menu. The Oreshnik missiles are not there to conquer Warsaw. They are there to ensure that Minsk does not become another Tripoli or another Baghdad. This is the consequence of the Wolfowitz doctrine carried to its logical conclusion. When you use democracy promotion as a cloak for regime change and resource extraction, you force your adversaries to harden their shells. You force them to abandon diplomacy for deterrence. The United States is now trapped in the wreckage of its own duplicity. They cannot argue against the Oreshnik deployment on principle because they have violated every principle they claim to uphold. They cannot argue based on spheres of influence because they have spent 30 years claiming such spheres don't exist, even as they expanded NATO to the Russian border. They have stripped the gears of international law so thoroughly that there is no friction left to stop the slide into total confrontation. This is the tragedy of the rules-based international order. It was never about rules, it was about who gets to break them. The U.S. reserved the right to invade, to bomb, to sanction, and to topple governments at will, while demanding strict adherence to the law from everyone else. But physics does not care about your moral superiority complex. A hypersonic missile does not care about your press releases or your UN resolutions. By pushing for total victory in Ukraine, by refusing to negotiate, by dreaming of the Balkanization of Russia, the Washington establishment has achieved the exact opposite of their goals, They wanted a weakened, isolated Russia. Instead, they have forged a Russia that has shed its illusions about the West, a Russia that has reindustrialized its military, and a Russia that is now willing to place the most advanced weaponry in human history on the European frontier. The Europeans, the tragic vassals in this drama, are the ones who will pay the price for this American hubris. They allowed their continent to be used as a staging ground for a war against a nuclear neighbor, believing the U.S. would shield them. Now they realize the shield is a lie, and the moral high ground they thought they stood on is actually a pile of skulls from the global south. The empire's run out of moral credit, and now, with the Oreshnik armed and waiting, it is running out of time. This is not just a missile deployment. It is the opening salvo of a global reckoning. We are witnessing the onset of true asymmetric warfare on a planetary scale. The Oreshnik is the kinetic manifestation of a much broader rebellion, a rebellion of the global south, the BRICS nations, and the revisionist powers against the suffocating grip of the Atlanticist empire. What we are seeing in Belarus is the military component of a strategy that also includes de-dollarization, alternative trade routes, and the systematic dismantling of Western institutional power. The West is terrified because the Oreshnik levels the playing field in a way they never anticipated. This is the essence of asymmetric warfare, using a relatively low-cost, high-impact capability to neutralize a trillion-dollar advantage. The United States spends nearly $1 trillion a year on defense, more than the next 10 nations combined. They have 11 aircraft carrier strike groups. They have a global network of 800 military bases. But all of that expensive heavy metal is rendered strategically irrelevant if your command centers, your logistics hubs, and your decision-making capitals can be vaporized in 4 minutes by a missile that costs a fraction of an F-35. Russia has effectively told NATO, you can keep your expensive toys. You can keep your aircraft carriers that are nothing more than floating coffins in a hypersonic war. We have bypassed your entire doctrine. This forces the West into a dilemma they cannot solve with money. To counter this, they would need to develop their own hypersonic interceptors, a technology they are years, perhaps a decade, behind on. And even if they could, the cost-exchange ratio is fatal. Spending $10 million to shoot down a $2 million missile is a recipe for bankruptcy, not victory. The geopolitical consequences are already rippling out far beyond Eastern Europe. China is watching this with intense interest. They see the panic in Washington. They see that the U.S. military, stretched thin and technologically stagnant, is struggling to contain one peer competitor in Europe. How can it possibly contain two? The Oreshnik deployment validates Beijing's own strategy of area denial in the South China Sea. It signals to the global South that the American century is over and that security can be found outside of the U.S. umbrella. We are seeing a reciprocal escalation that will tear the global economy apart. The West, in its desperation, will try to tighten the screws. They will demand that Europe sever all remaining ties with Russia. They will pressure the global South to choose sides. But this will only accelerate the fragmentation. The blowback will be economic devastation for Europe. Security is the foundation of economic stability. Who invests in a continent that sits under the shadow of a hypersonic sword? Who builds factories in a zone that is minutes away from annihilation? The risk premium for doing business in Europe just skyrocketed. We are looking at the importation of severe instability into the heart of the Western world. Inflation in Europe is not just about energy prices. It is about the structural cost of militarization. As NATO scrambles to respond, they will demand massive increases in defense spending from European welfare states that are already teetering on the brink of fiscal collapse. German pensioners will freeze so that Raytheon shareholders can thrive. French schools will crumble so that more useless interceptors can be bought. This is the transfer of wealth from the citizenry to the military-industrial complex, justified by a threat that the establishment itself created. The security architecture of the post-Cold War era was built on the assumption of Western invulnerability. That invulnerability is gone. We are entering an era of raw, unfiltered deterrence. The diplomatic channels are frozen. The trust is non-existent. The only language left is the language of force. And in this new dialect, Russia currently speaks with greater fluency than the West. The tragedy is that this was all avoidable. But the neoconservative cabal in Washington, blinded by their own ideology, refuse to see the world as it is. They refuse to accept a multipolar reality. They thought they could bully nuclear superpowers the same way they bullied Panama or Grenada. Now they are staring at a radar screen in a bunker watching a blip that represents the end of their delusions. This tension translates directly to your daily life. It means higher prices, unstable markets, and a constant gnawing anxiety about a war that could end civilization. It means that the peace dividend is dead and buried. The national security state will use this crisis to demand more power, more surveillance, and more censorship, arguing that disinformation is a threat equal to hypersonic missiles. They will try to silence voices like mine, voices that point out the root causes of this crisis, branding us as traitors for daring to speak the truth about their failures. But the reality is undeniable. The map has changed, the balance has shifted, and the Oreshnik in Belarus is the monolith standing in the center of Europe, a silent, terrifying testament to the fact that the West has lost control of the narrative, the technology, and the future. We have arrived at the final junction. We are standing at the absolute precipice of a new epoch. The activation of the Oreshnik system in Belarus is not merely a military deployment. It is the Suez moment for the American empire. Just as the Suez crisis of 1956 brutally exposed the United Kingdom as a fading imperial power that could no longer dictate terms to the world, this hypersonic checkmate exposes the United States as a hegemon in terminal decline, raging against the dying of the light, but powerless to stop the dawn of a new reality. The United States now faces the ultimate binary choice, a choice that will determine the fate of human civilization in the 21st century. It is a choice between humility and hubris, between adaptation and annihilation. Option one is the path of realism and restraint. It requires the Washington establishment to swallow the bitterest pill of all, to admit that the unipolar moment is over. It requires them to look at the map and acknowledge that they can no longer treat the security interests of Russia, China, and the global South as irrelevant inconveniences. It demands a return to diplomacy, a retreat from the borders of their nuclear peers, and an acceptance that the United States is merely one great power among many, not the God-appointed sheriff of the planet. It means dismantling the infrastructure of endless war and focusing on the rot within their own borders. Option two is the path of delusion. It is the path they are currently on. It is the belief that they can innovate their way out of geography and physics. It is the belief that if they just print more money, sanction more entities, and scream louder about democracy, reality will bend to their will. This is the path of the gambler who has lost his fortune but keeps doubling down, convinced that the next hand will save him. But in geopolitics, when you double down against a nuclear peer armed with unstoppable weaponry, you are not betting with chips. You are betting with the lives of hundreds of millions of people. I fear they will choose the second path. The ideology of American exceptionalism acts like a neurotoxin in the minds of the Western elite. They are psychologically incapable of conceiving a world where they are not in charge. They have drunk their own Kool-Aid for so long that they believe their own propaganda. They believe that history has a right side, and they are permanently on it. But history has no sides. History is a graveyard of empires that believed they were exceptional, right up until the moment the barbarians were at the gates, or in this case, until the hypersonic missiles were in Belarus. The Oreshnik is a physical manifestation of the end of the myth. It proves that the arc of history does not bend toward liberal hegemony. It bends toward power, resilience, and sovereignty. The world is not coming together under the banner of the West. It is fracturing into a multipolar order where raw capability matters more than moral platitudes. The West calls this aggression. I call it the return of consequences. For 30 years, the United States operated in a consequence-free environment. They broke nations, starved populations, and rewrote laws without fear of retaliation. That era died today. The shield is broken, the fortress is breached, the checkmate is on the board. The only question remaining is not whether the empire will fall, it is already falling. The question is whether it will accept its descent with grace, allowing a multipolar world to bloom, or whether it will try to pull the pillars of the temple down with it, ensuring that if it cannot rule the world, no one else will survive to inherit it. As you watch the mainstream media spin this story, as you watch them downplay the threat or cry out for more escalation, remember this. They are selling you a suicide pact disguised as patriotism. They are asking you to support a war they cannot win against an enemy they cannot defend against, for a hegemony that does not benefit you. The twilight is here. Do not look away.